In September 2014, Scotland will be making the decision to stay or leave the United Kingdom. I was born and educated in Scotland, but I've recently moved to England. This move has taken away my right to vote. I wondered if this was fair. I have strong ties to Scotland, and I have all intentions to move back. So why was I not included in this decision? I was out to discover if I, a Scottish expat, should have a say. So for the next few weeks, I'll be travelling around Britain, asking if myself and the other 750,000 expats should have a say in this monumental referendum. My first destination was London. I was keen to speak to others who had migrated south.
I moved down to London December 2012, but I went to university in Nottingham a few years before that. I understand that it's very difficult to define. Is it fair? No, it's not fair. I personally don't think it's particularly fair that I don't get a say in such an important decision, simply because I happen not to live there at the moment. But I do understand that the practicality of close to 1 million people and sorting out a postal vote, or where do you then draw the line, I guess. My uncle lives in Canada and hasn't lived in Scotland for a very long time, and probably doesn't intend to come back, perhaps. So I understand that he may not be able to vote, but considering I feel like I've only just left, and I don't get a say. It doesn't actually even matter which way I would vote. It's more the fact that I don't get a say is what irritates me.
The people that have the most right to vote are the people who are going to be most affected by the outcome. I think it's far too easy to say, if you look at the wider diaspora of Scotland, spread throughout the globe, and say everyone who deems themselves to be Scottish have the right to vote, I think you'll get a very different perspective on what independence means. I think it'll be very much more the emotional input to independence, as opposed to the practical, economic and political expediency that says it's a good idea for the people who live there.
If you don't live in Scotland, you don't pay taxes in Scotland, you choose to move south, why should you get a say?
Well, that's that's judging my future career pattern, my future life. No one's in a position to do that. As I've just said, I could decide to return to Scotland. I could move my family there. Anything can happen. To do that is judgmental and is not based on any hard evidence. However, there are Scots that currently live within the Union, and there are Scots who live outside the Union. I'd have thought that the Scots who live within the current Union ought to have some say. I'm less convinced that Scots, particularly second, third generation Scots who choose to live outside the Union, should have any influence on this at all.
Clearly there's a lot of effort needed to be done to go and dig out all the people who are not part of the north of Hadrian's Wall, part of the Union, but I'm sure that could be sorted out over time.
It seemed like opinion was fairly divided. On the one hand, we have to think about the sheer amount of Scottish people in the world. Many have not been involved in Scotland's affairs for years, so how could they make an informed decision? On the other hand, there are people like myself, who have only moved recently and take a firm interest in their homeland. So I was heading to Scotland to speak to people who still live there. My first stop was Glasgow to meet Tony and Alistair. Tony works for the pro-separation campaign Yes Scotland, and Alistair runs a series of activist groups that promotes the United Kingdom remaining together. I was hoping they could shed some light on the issue, and how it's viewed north of the border.
It's not about where you come from, it's about where we're going together as a country, as a nation. So your identity isn't really what matters here. What matters is everyone who lives in Scotland, who choose to live in Scotland, they're the ones who have the vote. If you don't live in Scotland, then Scotland's future isn't perhaps directly going to affect your life. You know, you choose to live elsewhere, that's a choice you make. I am an Italian citizen and I've been living in Scotland for 20 years and I choose to make Scotland my home, and as a result I get the vote.
The people who will be voting at the referendum on the 18th of September are all those British citizens, citizens of the Irish Republic, EU citizens and Commonwealth citizens who are registered and resident in Scotland. Outside of Scotland they won't be getting the vote, and the reason, for example, why Scottish people who identify as Scottish in the rest of the UK won't be getting the vote is because there isn't any logical way and there is no legal way in which to identify such people. Because at the end of the day, if somebody is living in London and says that he or she is Scottish, we really only have that particular person's word for it.
I was interested to hear what a member of Scottish Parliament had to say on the matter. So I was in the Scottish Borders speaking to MSP John Lamont.
Well, that was a very controversial issue during the negotiations between the UK government and the Scottish government when the terms of engagement were being agreed for the purposes of this vote in September. And it was agreed that the franchise who would be entitled to vote would be left to the Scottish government to decide. And they decided that it would be those voters who were entitled to vote in Scottish Parliament elections would be entitled to vote in the referendum in September. In addition to that, 16 and 17-year-olds would also be allowed to vote. Now, there was an argument to say, you know, people who were born in Scotland or people who had recently left Scotland but still defined themselves as being Scottish should also be allowed to vote. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that argument, but ultimately, a line had to be drawn in terms of the bureaucracy that would be associated with trying to identify every Scot around the world who might claim to have a right to vote and allowing them to vote. The actual bureaucracy involved in that and the cost associated with that was probably far too much to justify.
It seemed like the consensus was the same across the board. There are too many, and it's too much of a bureaucratic nightmare. But I still was not fully convinced. I decided to get a legal opinion, so I headed back to London to speak to lawyer James Wallace, who as an expat himself was raising the issue with the courts.
Now, there's two different systems in the UK. One is the Westminster system and one is the Scottish system. In Westminster, if you've been living outside of the country for up to 15 years, you can still vote. Scottish system, no vote the minute you leave. So this struck me as rather unfair because the franchise, the voting system, has been extended to such a large degree to include, you know, Canadians, students that just suddenly come into the country, but excluded to prevent anyone who'd been living in Scotland, born in Scotland, and had just moved away from voting. And it struck me as insane. So I went about and decided I was going to kick up a bit of a fuss. So I set up a wee petition because you need a petition in order to say you've got a petition. And then I set up a Twitter account and started getting in contact with MSPs. So I met a lot of the MSPs at the time this was being discussed, and I met a lot of the parties. So it really concerned me because different parties wanted different things. The SNP were very clear in what they wanted. They wanted 16, 17-year-olds voting, and they wanted just those living in Scotland. Now the problem with that is those living in Scotland, that was the same vote as for devolution, and that was the vote in the normal Scottish Parliament. But the trouble is that affects people living in Scotland. Independence affects everyone. It affects your citizenship, affects your nationality. It is a much bigger deal. So the Scottish Parliament is almost like a bigger local council. There's nothing that the Scottish Parliament does now that affects me living in London. Whereas independence, well, we've already found out that I will automatically become a Scottish citizen with no say. So to become a citizen of another country without any say, and with citizenship comes rights, responsibilities, everything, it just doesn't seem fair. I spoke to a QC who is at the top of his field in EU law, and a legal opinion is basically what that QC would decide if he was sitting in court. So what is the law? It is against the law for what they're doing, and they're breaking EU law. So while the Scottish Government can set the franchise and set the voting system however they like, because they've been given that power by Westminster, it can't breach the law. Because no one actually thought that what they're doing is wrong. They thought it was morally wrong, but they didn't believe that it was legally wrong. And so what our campaign has established is that it's legally wrong. And so the whole thing is just ridiculous. And everyone's been giving nice little excuses as to why it would be easier, why it just makes sense. Well, it doesn't make sense. And the first thing that you need to get right in an independence referendum is who gets to vote. And if you can't get that right, how on earth are you going to get everything else right?
I would hope the Scottish Government would reconsider their decision. Or maybe the EU will make the decision for them. There is no question that there are many Scottish people all over Britain who would like to have their vote. But with the referendum fast approaching and politics heating up, my instinct tells me their voices will fall upon deaf ears.